Believe it or not, back in high school, my least favorite subject was English. I know, seems unbelievable now, right? I love reading books and all, but oh my gosh, I hated high school English. And to make that statement even more peculiar, I didn't hate English because of like grammar or anything like that. I loved the grammar lessons. I loved writing essays. But no, the reason I hated English class was that we had to read books. And I hated that so much. Growing up, I had never been a big reader. I remember my dad having me read the books to movies I wanted to watch, and I usually just ended up reading like 80%, and I just told him I was done. And then I'd watch the movie, and of course, I hadn't read the last of the book, so I was like, what in the world? That's crazy. But I hated reading. And I hated reading in what was probably my least favorite class throughout all of high school, and that was American literature. There were a couple good things in this class. I got introduced to Catcher in the Rye, but I also had a weird teacher that was like, the definition of American isn't what you think it is, and we read like Colombian literature instead of American literature, which, would be fine if it weren't for the fact that next year I'd take world literature, so that's an unnecessary thing. If I'm in American literature, I'd expect like United States literature, but that's a different topic. I hated this class. I hated the teacher for this class. It was a horrible class. But I got to read Catcher in the Rye, which was cool. Everything else sucked. Hated giving presentations on stuff like The Great Gatsby. I do not care about the green light. But the last unit in the class was a pick your own book unit. The only stipulation was that the book had to be written by an American author. And me, I'm not interested in books. I don't know what American authors there are. So I spent like the entire class Googling American books to read. And I was like, what would be really American is if I read a Western. So I kind of just searched up the best Westerns to read. And one book that kept showing up is Lonesome Dove. I was kind of on the fence about choosing Lonesome Dove because, again, I don't like books, so I'm not going to be on the fence for any book I choose. But there was a quote on the book from USA Today, and the quote was, "If you only read one Western novel in your life, read Lonesome Dove." I was like, all right, that's kind of a good sell. I never thought I'd be sold on a book by one of those quotes on the back of the book, but here we are. That's a cool quote. I'll read it. So I had my dad order the Lonesome Dove on Amazon, and it came in the mail, and it was a behemoth of a book, 850 pages. I was like, oh, that's a bit bigger than anything I've ever read. And what made it even worse is I showed up to class the next day, and every single person around me had chosen a book that was less than 200 pages. Must I remind you, I hated reading books, so I'm there with this tome, and everyone else has like a 180-page book. But the teacher came by and she's like, oh, that's a good book. Good choice. And oh boy, was I in for a treat. I had to read this 800-page book in 3 weeks. And then we had to write an essay and do a presentation on it. I hated that. But boy, did I like reading Lonesome Dove. This was the first book I ever got to choose to read, and it was absolutely amazing. I was hooked from the start. Although the first 100 pages are a really big drag, but I spent hours each week reading. Every day in the cafeteria, I'd be reading this Lonesome Dove book, and it was good. It was really good. And so now, after reading a lot more books after Lonesome Dove and reviving my interest in reading, I decided, you know what? Let's revisit Lonesome Dove. And I am not a fast reader, so this 850-page book is your explanation as to why there has not been an upload recently, and it is because I have been trucking through this book. And man, was it worth it. I still love this book. Lonesome Dove is my favorite book of all time, and we're going to talk about it today, and I'm going to build a little monument to it later in the video, just because it's really important to me personally, because it's the book that kind of just created my love for reading. If I had chosen a different book, I probably would hate books, but Lonesome Dove was something special. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And like I said, we're going to be building a statue later in the video, but first, I want to make a sign up here, sort of just like a Hollywood sign, but I want the name of the town to be up here and it's going to say Fort Oxbow right there. I think that'll look really nice, but because of all the trees in this area, the scale gets really messed up, so I think I'm just going to go and chop down all these mega pine trees. We really don't want them there because it's going to mess up the scale. Although I think I got rid of the main issues right there. We might not touch this area. I think I might just chop down a couple of those. So that is the plan for today. But before I can start yapping about this book, we're going to have to summarize the book, just so everyone's on the same page with me. And before we do that, I want to talk about why this book even exists. So there's this guy, Larry McMurtry. He's an author, a Western author, and kind of his explanation for writing Lonesome Dove is that he was very tired of the Westerns at the time being completely inaccurate. He thought that lots of people were romanticizing the Old West and making it kind of mythologized and inaccurate, and he was like, the West was actually really horrible. I'm going to write a book to show everyone why the West was such an awful place. So he sat down and wrote Lonesome Dove, and what ended up happening is, of course, quotes like, hey, if you only read one Western in your life, read Lonesome Dove. He kind of just revolutionized the genre. So it's one of those cases where, like, the author doesn't really like the book because of the public reception, because he was trying to, like, show why the West was horrible and you wouldn't want to be in the West, and he ended up making cowboys a lot more famous than they once were. Lonesome Dove eventually became a TV miniseries, like a 4-part miniseries, and some people say it's one of the best adaptations of a book that exists. It stars, I think, Robert Duvall and Tommy Lee Jones. Those are the two main characters, but apparently the author hasn't even watched that series because he just, I don't know. I don't get it. If I wrote a book and people took it the wrong way, but there's still a TV show, I think I'd enjoy that quite a bit. That's like the dream for modern authors, is to get your TV show. Oh, it ruins the art of the book or something like that. I don't know. Anyway, I think that's all I really wanted to talk about for that segment. Pretty short. I got these saplings from a wandering trader a couple episodes ago, and I think the white is going to work perfectly for our little sign. But yeah, now that that is done, we can go ahead and start a brief summary of the book. I know I haven't talked about the book at all this episode. We're like 8 minutes in. But hey, I'm starting now, alright? We're going to summarize the book. I have an entire notebook page of notes to summarize, so I'm gonna like fly through these. My summary will not be able to encapsulate anything in this book. It's kind of just a brief summary so I can talk about some of my interpretations and stuff like that. So yeah, without further ado, let's begin the summary. So the book is going to start off in the border town known as Lonesome Dove, and this town is a couple miles north of the Rio Grande, so that makes it one of the towns on the border between Mexico and Texas. And we're immediately introduced to one of the main characters of the book, which is Augustus McCrae. And Augustus McCrae is sitting on the porch and he kicks off a couple of pigs off of his patio, and they eat like a rattlesnake or something. I don't know, that's very... First lines are always weird like that, but as he's sitting there, we're going to be introduced to several more characters, so I'll just introduce all of them right now. Augustus McCrae, also known as Gus, he's some like older cowboy, used to be a Texas Ranger and helped fight in some of the Indian Wars, but now he's just retired. And then he also has a buddy named Woodrow Call, and Woodrow Call is also a Texas Ranger, rangered with Mr. McCrae, and he's kind of a stoic individual, while Augustus is more of an Epicurean, you know, just like enjoy every aspect of life, you don't have to work. While Woodrow is like, your life is for a duty, you gotta serve a purpose, that sort of stuff. Then we're also introduced to a character known as P.I. P.I. is kind of a, like, you know, your generic town fool, I guess. He's not very smart, but he also used to ranger with Gus and Call, and now he kind of just works for them in this little like cattle outfit. And then we're also introduced to a little kid, I think he's like 14 in the book. This guy is Newt. Newt is the son of a prostitute named Maggie. We'll get back to that later. Gus and Call adopted him after Maggie died, So he kind of just works with the cattle company right now. Or not, it's not a cattle company, it's like a horse outfit. They sell horses. And then the last character, just in the like first couple chapters, is going to be Bolivar. And Bolivar is some Mexican, I think he used to be something called like a pistolero, but he's done with his banditing and now he just lives on the horse outfit with all of the other characters and he cooks for them. And whenever dinner's ready, he goes out to this bell that they have and he just smacks it with a crowbar and it really annoys everyone. Everyone hates it when he smacks a crowbar. But yeah, that's all the characters there. Although we're going to get introduced to a couple more characters immediately after because they go to a saloon, or at least Gus. Gus goes to a saloon called the Dry Bean Saloon, I think. And there's this like whore there that is very famous around the region because of how pretty she is or something. Her name is Lorena. She's actually probably the third main character of the book, so she's actually a very well-designed character. A lot of people actually say that the women in this book are actually way more developed than the men. But yeah, Lorena's there, and she starts playing a game of cards with Gus. And Gus and her are good friends or something. So yeah, while they're playing cards, this guy named Dish, he's nicknamed Dish because one day he was like really thirsty and he said he'd drink anything and he drank dishwater. But Dish is like really desperate for Lorena and like she charges I think like $2. So he's like begging Gus the entire night for some money so he can get with Lorena. And Gus decides to give it to him. But the guy's like plastered. He's super drunk. He stays over with the horse outfit. Now, we're going to introduce even more characters. Don't worry. So the next day, they're all eating breakfast that Bolivar has cooked. And they see two people coming up on the distance. One of these characters is someone they're already really familiar with, and that is Joshua Dietz. And Joshua Dietz is another ranger that rangered with them. He's an African-American or a black man. So, it being like the 1870s, I think, there's obviously like dynamics there throughout the whole book. But Dietz was just like dropping off the mail or ordering something in like San Antonio or something. And he comes riding in with a character known as Jake Spoon. Jake Spoon also used to ranger with the rest of them. He's a very young guy, kind of accidentally shot someone, but got him in like the head. So he's like known for being a sharpshooter, even though he did it by accident. He comes into Lonesome Dove, which is the town, and they all talk for a bit. And Jake's like, yeah, after I rangered with you guys, I traveled around a bit. I went up to Montana. Montana's really pretty. And then I went to Arkansas and I got in a fight with someone at a bar, so I shot a gun. And then it went through the wall and shot the mayor. And the mayor's brother is the sheriff, and now he's hunting me. So I'm just in Lonesome Dove to pass the time. But this talk of Montana gets Woodrow Call very interested because he's like, oh, that'd be good cattle country and no one's up there yet. I want to go up there now. And Gus is really upset. He's like, why? We can just drink whiskey down here all day. Why would I go where it's cold? But Woodrow is really interested in going up to Montana now because of Jake Spoon coming in and talking about how nice Montana is. So now we have Woodrow Call who's like, I need a bunch of cattle to take up to Montana. And then there's a guy called Will Barger and he just stumbles into the little like horse outfit and he's like, hey, do you guys sell horses? Someone stole all my horses, and I think it's some Mexican bandit. And Call's like, oh, yeah, we'll get the horses back for you. We'll just go into Mexico for a raid. So that night, a bunch of them all go into Mexico to steal horses, and they end up finding Will Barger's horses, and they'll return them the next day, but they also steal some other horses. They also find some Irishmen. There's just like two Irish guys that are really lost. And they came to the United States because they were promised of really good land, and now they're in the middle of the deserts in Texas and Mexico. So the boys decide to take them back to Lonesome Dove. Well, anyway, they get back to Lonesome Dove, and Dish is like itching to go talk to Lorena again. But when he gets there, he finds that Jake Spoon has like won her over completely. Normally, she's really like stone-faced and doesn't want to talk to anyone, but with Jake Spoon, she's just like super happy and smiley and whatever. So Dish really doesn't like Jake Spoon after that because he can't get with Lorena because Lorena stops selling herself. So anyway, over the span of the next few months, Call keeps raiding into Mexico to go steal cattle from the Mexicans, and he ends up getting quite a few cows. So they end up hiring some people from nearby areas, and they start going up north. And since Lorena is in love with Jake Spoon, she says that she's also coming along, and so Jake Spoon and Lorena stay a bit outside the rest of the cattle. But yeah, Lorena does end up coming with all of them. I forgot to mention one thing, which is that Jake Spoon is promising Lorena that he'll take her to San Francisco. He has no actual intention of taking her to San Francisco, but Lorena really wants to go because that's where she thinks she can restart her life. Anyway, right before she leaves, the owner of the saloon, which is Xavier Wands, who's given her a bed and a job basically her entire time in Lonesome Dove, is like, no, Jake Spoon's gonna not take you to San Francisco. If you want and you'll marry me right now, I'll take you to San Francisco. And then she's like, no, I like Jake Spoon. Xavier Wands decides to not go with the cattle company, and we'll get back to him later. But yeah, a couple of them are kind of teary-eyed leaving Lonesome Dove because they've lived there so long and they like it, even if it's not that great of a town. And they start heading up north. So I'm now going to cut to the second storyline in this book, which, if you remember, there's that sheriff that's coming after Jake Spoon because Jake Spoon shot the mayor and the mayor's brother is the sheriff. And this sheriff's name is July Johnson. And July Johnson's like, I didn't really know my brother that well. He was the oldest, I'm the youngest. I really don't want to go after him. But then the mayor's widow, some girl named Peach, she's like, no, July Johnson, you gotta go find my husband's killer. So he's like, oh, okay, I guess. So he saddles up and he's in a really unhappy marriage because his wife hates him or something like that and won't talk to him at all. But she has a little kid named Joe, and she's like, why don't you take Joe with you? And he's like, oh, okay, yeah, sure, I'll take Joe. So then he leaves and he heads to Lonesome Dove to try and find Jake Spoon. Then a couple days later, they find out that his wife, Elmira, has run away or just like disappeared or something. So then Peach runs over to the sheriff assistant, I guess, deputy sheriff, something like that. And this guy's name is Roscoe. And she's like, hey, Roscoe, July Johnson, your boss, his wife ran off. What are you going to do about it? He's like, oh, well, I don't know. And then she's all like, you need to go find July Johnson and tell him his wife is missing. So then Roscoe leaves like 4 days later in attempt to find July Johnson. And on the way to finding July Johnson, Roscoe stumbles upon this girl that's being like abused or something, and she runs away and starts following him. Her name is like Janie, I think. So now we're gonna cut back to the cattle outfit. They decide to cross this river called the Nueces, I think. And when they're crossing the river, one of the Irishmen walks their horse right through the nest of a bunch of moccasins. I don't know, it's some sort of water snake. Anyway, they bite him like 50,000 times and he dies. So yeah, just like that first death, Sean, the Irishman, is no longer with us. And then later during like a sandstorm or something like that, there's also a thunderstorm. And during the thunderstorm, one of the guys gets struck with lightning, or at least lightning strikes nearby and it kills him. So that guy's one of the ones they just hired. So that guy also died. But yeah, every night, Gus goes and checks on Lorena and Jake Spoon, and they end up fighting a lot because Jake Spoon wants to go over to San Antonio to go gamble a bit, and Lorena's like, no, I want you to take me to San Francisco. So then Jake Spoon angrily just leaves her. So Gus goes to check on her, and while he's checking on her, they see some Indian bandit. This guy is Blue Duck, which is a famous bandit around the area, known for kidnappings and stuff like that. So Gus is like, hey, you should probably come and stay and camp with the rest of us. And she's like, no, Jake Spoon will come back. Just watch. Anyway, Jake Spoon does not come back and she ends up being kidnapped. So that's rough. So then Augustus McRae, our good man, he decides like, okay, you guys can run the cattle for a bit. I'm gonna go chase after Blue Duck to go rescue Lorena. And then Call is like, why would you do that for a woman you don't even love? And he's all like, bro, she got kidnapped. What are you talking about? Anyway, Gus tracks Lorena down, finds that Blue Duck has sold her off to a couple buffalo hunters and a couple Indians. But yeah, right before that, we're going to cut back to Roscoe and July Johnson. They finally meet up, and Roscoe's like, hey, your wife left, and she left on a whiskey boat, everyone thinks. And he's like, oh, what? She left on a whiskey boat? Oh my gosh. I don't really care about finding Jake Spoon anymore. I gotta find my wife. So then he cuts north to go and find his wife instead of Jake Spoon. But now it's a whole group of them, and then while they're just out in the prairie, they stumble upon Gus, and Gus is like, oh, I'm with Jake Spoon. I don't know where he is anymore because he left us in San Antonio. But if you don't mind, you're a sheriff, right? You should help me rescue this woman. And he's kind of like, oh, yeah, sure, I can do that. Anyway, Gus charges in, guns blazing, and he is basically single-handedly able to take out all of the people and rescue Lorena. And then July Johnson just kind of stands there in disbelief. He's like, dang, I'm really useless. But July Johnson and Gus get back to Roscoe and Janie and Joe, and they find that they've been scalped and are dead now. So they bury the group, and then they decide, okay, well, I'm July Johnson. I gotta go find my wife. So Gus is like, all right, cool. And he brings Lorena back to camp, and Lorena's traumatized because she was like kidnapped. And sort of to contrast the like Indian kidnapping thing, the author puts in a little story about Newt, which is that boy who's the son of the prostitute. He gets lost in a dust storm, and once the dust storm ends, he sees like a whole group of Indians, and he's like, oh no, they're gonna kill me. I gotta kind of just surrender to them. And they all kind of laugh, and they end up leading him back to the herd that he had lost. This group of Indians, they're all like starving pretty bad. So it's a very big contrast from like the big scary bandit versus the actual reality of most of them just starving and wanting to do good deeds for food. But anyway, yeah, Gus brings Lori back to the herd safely, and they're all back together once again, except for Jake Spoon. Jake Spoon decides to stay in Fort Worth, Texas. He ends up meeting these guys called the Scuggs Brothers, and the Scuggs Brothers are some like real bad people. They always talk about killing guys and whatnot, and they're like, Jake Spoon, you're gonna help us rob banks up in Nebraska. Or sorry, up in Kansas. You're gonna help us rob a bank. And Jake Spoon is like, yeah, I want to go up to Nebraska through Kansas anyway, so I'll just tag along with you guys. Immediately, the Scuggs brothers start causing trouble. Jake Spoon kills, like, some settler's husband. But yeah, we'll get back to the Jake Spoon storyline here in a second, because we're going to talk about July Johnson and him finding his wife, Elmira. He works his way up to Dodge, which is a city in, I believe, is Kansas. I'm not quite sure. I think it's Kansas. It might be Nebraska. It's one of the two. But he gets up there into Dodge, and he's like, hey, I have a wife named Elmira. She might have come here on a whiskey boat. And then the people there are like, oh, yeah. Yeah, we know Elmira. She came up here on a whiskey boat, but she's actually left Dodge, and she's working her way up to... And she's actually working her way up to Nebraska. She went with a couple buffalo hunters. So July Johnson's like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. Maybe I should go up to Nebraska as well. But yeah, while he's there, the townspeople are like, oh, we used to know Elmira, your wife. We didn't think she'd ever get married because she was a prostitute. And he's like, what the heck? I didn't know that. Anyway, her son is dead, so I gotta tell her anyway. But yeah, anyway, we'll cut back to Jake Spoon now. No more July Johnson and his lovely wife. But Jake Spoon, he's with the Scuggs brothers. They end up robbing some of the settlers up in Kansas. So they find some people that I think only speak German. And they're like, hey, give us all your money. And they scare them, and they take all their money. So not nice people, you don't want to interact with the Scuggs brothers. But Jake Spoon's like, it's all right. I just need to get through Kansas with these guys. I can deal with them for now. Well, the Skuggs brothers end up coming across a man known as Will Barger, which was the guy at the start of the story that needed the help of like Gus and all them to get horses because some Mexicans had stolen them. But the Skuggs brothers all go in and attack Will Barger and his man, and they get, I think, a couple good shots on them. Will Barger escapes, but the guys try and steal all the horses that they were taking around. But Will Barger, like, runs off on his horse and ends up finding Gus and Call, and he's like, hey, there's some guy that shot me and took all my horses. So then Gus and Call are like, okay, we'll track him down. Don't you worry, Will Barger. You're a nice fellow. We'll track him down for you. So to make a long story short, they track down the killers, which end up being the Skuggs brothers and Jake Spoon. And they're like, Jake Spoon, you should know better than to run with horse thieves. And Jake Spoon's like, no, I was just trying to get through the territory. I didn't actually, like these guys. And they're like, well, you killed a bunch of people. You hung someone and like burned them up. That's not really good. You're a former Texas Ranger, and they hang Jake Spoon. So Jake Spoon is dead now. He also forgot about Lorena, but he was also drunk. So that's that. But yeah, right before he dies, he gives little old Newt, his horse, which is a nice pacing pony thing. I don't know what that means, but that's what they say. It's a pacing pony. So Newt's kind of sad because he kind of saw, or Newt's actually pretty sad because he saw Jake Spoon almost as a father figure, because Jake Spoon had spent a lot of time around his mom, which was the prostitute. Oh, and Will Barger also dies. He's a dead man. We're going to cut back to the July Johnson storyline now because it's relevant again. And that is because Elmira, which is the runaway wife, stumbles upon a woman's horse ranch. This woman is known as Clara Allen. And Clara Allen actually used to date Augustus and Jake Spoon back in the day. And Augustus is still really in love with her. So she's been brought up a lot of times. But Elmira, she finds herself on this farm. And it turns out she's pregnant. And it's July Johnson's kid. And she really doesn't want it. She hates July Johnson. July Johnson's like the worst thing that's ever happened to her. So she ends up giving birth, and she's like, I hate this kid, I don't want it. And she runs away. So now Clara is stuck with this kid, but she really likes kids. All her sons have died from disease. So this is like a son, and she's like, I will cherish this boy. So it turns out that Elmira was running away because she never wanted to get married to July Johnson. She actually loves a guy named D. Boot, which is a buffalo hunter, and she wants to marry him, but the guy's kind of like Jake Spoon in a sense that he just kind of sleeps around with all the prostitutes of the area. But it turns out D. Boot is actually going to be hung the next day, or hanged, sorry. So D. Boot's going to be hanged, and Elmira gets to show up like the last day before he's hanged, but she's really sick because she had a really bloody birth. And so D-Boot dies, and then July Johnson actually stumbles upon Clara's ranch as well. And Clara's like, no way, this is your kid. And he's like, I gotta find my wife. My wife run away. He ends up finding Clara in the town where old D-Boot is. And he's like, Clara, I found you. I've been searching forever. And Elmira's like really upset because she hates July Johnson. And so July Johnson gets pretty sad because his wife doesn't want him. And then he's staying in the town, and he goes to visit the hospital the next day, and she's run off with the buffalo hunters. She ends up getting scalped by Indians and killed. So, that's the life in Nebraska during the time. But July Johnson makes his way back to Clara's ranch, and Clara's like, you need to get some soul in you. You're gonna work for me. And he's like, oh, okay. So yeah, we'll meet up with them in a bit, because we're going to jump back to... What is this? Just a block of clay right here? What the heck? We're going to cut back to our boys in the cattle drive. Newt's pretty upset over Jake Spoon's death. He's like, why'd we have to kill Jake Spoon? And Woodrow Call is, well, once you're a horse thief, you're always a horse thief. If it was anyone else, we'd hang them. It doesn't matter if it's Jake Spoon. And Newt doesn't like this answer. Dietz also went to go help, and Dietz doesn't like this answer either. He's like, Jake Spoon was a fine man. I like Jake Spoon. Anyway, the cattle herd makes their way up to what is Ogallala, which is in Nebraska, and all the boys go into town, and there's a cavalry officer in the army that is like, hey, you need to give us your horses. Your horses are healthy and our horses are bad. And Call is like, no, these are our horses. We ain't giving them to you. But when the boys go into town, there's a cavalry officer that is like, I'm going to take your horses. And there's nothing your stubborn captain man can do about it because he's not here and I'm going to take your horses. So he tries taking the horses. He ends up beating up Newt. He ends up beating up Dish. And Call sees this. So he charges his horse into the officer and starts beating him up. He smashes his head into like the anvil at the blacksmith. And then Gus has to like lasso him to stop. And yeah, it causes a huge scene because it's just some cowboy beating up an officer of the army. And once he's done beating up the guy, he's like, I hate rude behavior in a man. I won't tolerate it. And that's the end of that. But yeah, Augustus decides like, hey, I'm going to go see Clara because I love Clara. And they go to Clara. Clara really hates Woodrow Call and she's really annoyed by him. Augustus also brings Lorena. And they kind of love each other, but Augustus really loves Clara. Anyway, what ends up happening is that Lorena really likes the lifestyle that Clara lives, so she's like, Augustus, I'm gonna stay here. And Augustus is like, you know what? That's probably good for you. You shouldn't be around a bunch of cattlemen like us. So Lorena stays, and anyway, after all the Ogallala shenanigans they get into, all the boys, the cattle drive decides to keep heading north, and they gotta go through Wyoming. And their chef keeps saying like, it's gonna be dry. Enjoy the water while it's here. It's gonna be dry in Wyoming. This guy needs to die. Freaking jerk. Anyway, yeah, it ends up being pretty dry up in Wyoming. And while they're up in Wyoming, they encounter some Indians that steal some horses from them. Gus, Call, and the African-American guy, Dietz, they all go after the horses, and they're like, it's probably just some starving Indians. If they had just talked to us, we could have just given some cattle to them, but the horses are kind of useful for us. And sure enough, when they get there, there's a bunch of starving Indians, and they all run and hide, but there's one kid there that's blind and just starts crying, and Dietz is like, oh, what a poor kid. We're not dangerous at all. So he goes and picks up the kid, which, you know, that scares the Indians that are there. So one guy charges at him with a spear, and Dietz dies. So R.I.P. Dietz. And this is a horrible death because, you know, what the heck? Because, you know, Dietz is a really important character. He's one of the original people from from Lonesome Dove. And most importantly, he is their head scout. So he's been the one in charge of finding water. And now that he's dead, you know, they're going to have problems finding water. But this death definitely upsets Call quite a bit. It upsets him so much that he ends up making a grave for Dietz. And he just talks about how Dietz was an honorable man, served under him for a long time. So after they watch Call write this gravestone, Gus looks over at Newt and he's like, Newt, let's go look at what your dad wrote on the gravestone. And Newt's like, wait, what? My dad? So now it's officially been relayed to Newt that his dad, his mystery dad that slept with his like prostitute mom, is Woodrow Call. And Woodrow Call hasn't admitted that he is his father because he views sleeping with a prostitute as like a low point in his life. So he just hasn't mentioned it ever. Gus is like, I really thought that your dad would mention it at some point, but since he isn't, I'll just let you know. But yeah, after Dietz dies, Gus and P.I. become the new scouts, and they get sent to go find some water or like a river crossing or something. And Gus is messing around, just like enjoying the open prairie. And he goes over a hill and ends up like upsetting a whole tribe of Blood Indians. And the Blood Indians charge at him and shoot him with an arrow. So they hide out for a bit, and then P.I. walks all the way back to the cattle company and like explains what happens. So Woodrow Call goes up trying to find Gus. And he finds him in Miles City because a guy helps Gus out. Gus now has one less leg. And he's all like, oh, you gotta shoot me, man. I don't want to live a life with only one leg. And Call's like, no, you've got plenty of living to do. But turns out they actually have to saw off the other leg as well because it's rotting. And Gus is like, "You're not taking my leg," and he threatens to shoot the doctor. So because they don't take his leg, Gus ends up dying because his body just rots completely. So, another big death. You don't really expect Gus to die in the book, but he's dead. He's gone. But before his death, he asks Call, like, "Hey, could you go bury me back in Texas?" And Call's like, "I guess I can do that. I mean, it's prettier up here in Montana." Gus is like, "Well, I was happier back in Texas. That's where I dated Clara. And, happiest points in my life were down there. So go bury me in the picnic spot that I used to eat picnics with Clara." So Call ends up making that promise right before Gus dies, and it's sort of a joke that it's a fight between the unstoppable force of Woodrow Call and just the random absurdness of Augustus McCrae. But Woodrow Call gets back to the cattle company, and they're all sad about Gus's death. But they keep going north, and they find an area up on the Milk River, which is almost next to Canada. And they set up a little cabin and a ranch, and in the spring, I think Dish decides to leave because he's like, "Lorena's just down in Nebraska. I'm not living here in this winter hellscape. I'm gonna go try my chances with Lorena." So he makes his way down back to Clara, and works for Clara in order to try and swoon Lorena. Yeah, it turns out Newt is actually really good at breaking in horses on the ranch, just like his dad, Woodrow Call. But one day there's some horse thieves that steal a bunch of their horses. And so Call, Newt, and I think some others go and chase down the horse thieves. And it ends up being some like alcoholic and his son. And they end up hanging the alcoholic dad. But then Call is like, "You know what? I'll leave the boy alive. He could be a good boy or whatever." And the guy works on the ranch for quite a bit, and he's actually pretty good. But then one day they catch him stealing everyone's like wallets or something, I guess. So Call goes and hangs the guy. That's kind of like an attempt at redemption for hanging Jake Spoon. But then Call is also proven right that all horse thieves will just steal anyway. But yeah, Augustus has been packed in salt over the winter to preserve his body. So Call is like, "Okay, well, it's spring now. I gotta go bury Augustus down in Texas." But before he leaves, he goes and talks with Newt. What he does is he gives Newt his really nice horse. And then he gives Newt a watch from his dad. And then he also gives Newt his best gun. And then he almost hugs Newt and he starts choking up, and then he just turns around and leaves. So that would have been the point where, you admit that he is in fact your kid, but the best he can do is give him gifts. And then Woodrow Call gets on a horse and makes his way down back to Miles City, and he picks up Augustus's body and puts him in a wagon and starts heading south back to Texas. But as he's going south, he has to stop by Clara's ranch because Augustus wrote his will and he made it so his half ownership of the cattle herd is inherited by Lorena, so she gets half of the profits. So he has to stop by Clara's ranch and drop off the profits. Clara's all upset because she's like, "Woodrow Call, I hate you. You need to go admit that you're Newt's dad and go back to him because he's alive and he needs you in his life. Your promise that you made to Augustus is just an excuse for you to leave. That's all men ever do, is they leave." But Call's like, "No, I made a promise. I gotta go fulfill my duty." Clara's like, "He wants to be buried at our picnic spot, the picnics we went on. I'm alive here. Bury him here so he's actually remembered by people that loved him." And Call's like, "Nope, he said he wants to be buried in Texas." So he continues down south to Texas after leaving Clara's ranch. And on the way down, he kind of gets all gloomy and sad, and he's like, "I don't even know it's right anymore." As he's going through Kansas, people are asking him like, "Hey, aren't you the guy that's bringing a body all the way back to Texas? And aren't you the guy that did the first cattle drive to Montana?" And he starts getting really annoyed with all the people asking questions like that, so he ends up going through the prairies of Colorado instead. But as he's going through there, he meets up with an old friend from his rangerin' days. He's like, "Hey, I heard that bandit Blue Duck is finally gonna be killed down in New Mexico." And Call's like, "Oh yeah, I got to deal with Blue Duck. I'll go watch him hang." So he gets to New Mexico, and Blue Duck's like, I should have killed you when I saw you, old man, blah, blah, blah. Before Blue Duck can even be hanged, he jumps out a window and, like, he holds the sheriff that arrested him while he jumps out the window, so they both die. But yeah, he finally makes his way down to Texas. He buries Gus, and then he was like, I'm close enough to Lonesome Dove. I'll just go back and see what's going on. He realizes that one of the buildings is missing, so he goes and asks the local barber, like, hey, wasn't something there? And the guy's like, oh yeah, that used to be the Dry Bean Saloon. After you guys left for your cattle drive, the owner, Xavier Wands, he burned the place down, and he burned himself up in the process. And the final line in the book is something like, yeah, he burned himself up in there. They said he loved that whore. And if you don't remember, this guy was offering to take Lorena to San Francisco because he actually loved her. And then Lorena was like, no, I'll go be with Jake Spoon. And then, so this guy is like, there's no purpose in life, and he just kills himself. And that's the ending of Lonesome Dove. Really brief summary, I know. I gotta stop doing these massive summary segments, but I don't know. Let me know if you guys like it. We're gonna talk about the book here in a bit. Is the summary helpful? Would you rather I just like analyze the book instead and talk about like lessons from the book? Or does the summary help conceptualize all of the lessons? I don't know. Leave your thoughts in the comments. But we've gotten rid of all the big trees around here, which I think helps with the scale. And then we have Fort Oxbow written up there on the mountain. Yeah, if we just go up here on one of these terraced farms, take a gander, look at that. Of course, we've got this eyesore right here, which is the steel mill that I will build eventually. But otherwise, like, look at that. That's almost postcard-esque. Yeah, this is... What the heck is this guy doing? Hold on. Oh my goodness. I hate these guys. Die! Jerk. I hate Enderman. Worst mob in the game. Alright, so yeah, that is all for the summary, and like I said, we're going to now be building a little special monument to this book. It's pretty generic and it kind of fits in the town, but it's a subtle nod to this book and what it means to me, and if it weren't for this book, I don't think I would be as into reading as I am now. This is the book that saved any passion I could have had for reading. So while we build that, let's go ahead and talk about some of my thoughts from the book. So the first thing I want to talk about is how every person in this book feels real. And I know you probably don't get that impression based on just like my summary that I gave. It's hard to summarize an 850-page book into a summary like that and then still get the same feeling that you do when you read the book. But when I was reading the book, like every single character in this book feels real. They have depth to them. All of them have some sort of flaw. And like most books I read, and I've read books that are like 1,200 pages, so it's not like a book length thing. But other books that I read, like, characters are sort of an archetype. Like, oh, this is sort of the main character, and he's gonna do main character things. However, in this book, like, every single character is complex. They have their own individual backstory. They have their own ambitions and desires, and their own flaws. And everyone just feels real. And I think that's a great contrast to death, right? All these characters are alive, they feel real. And that makes their deaths feel real. When Dietz dies, when Gus dies, you feel the absence of them. Their presence is no longer there, and you don't really notice that in many books. I think Lonesome Dove does that spectacularly. And the deaths, too, they don't serve a literary purpose. They kind of just happen. You can never expect death. It comes at abrupt times, no one can really expect it, and Lonesome Dove is able to provide that experience. Especially with Jake Spoon, because Jake Spoon throughout the story is kind of just like a character that's had a lot of bad luck. Gus and Collar here, he's gonna have a redemption arc. But instead, they're just like, nope, well, you're a horse thief, and they hang him. And it's really abrupt. You don't really see it coming. And yeah, McMurtry just does a really good job of bringing life to characters while they're alive, and then making you feel the absence of them when they're dead. The next point I want to make is about sort of like what I think the theme of the book is. And I think you can actually pull a quote from the book to kind of view the message of the story. And that quote is from Augustus McCrae talking to Lori while Lori's talking about how she's going to go to San Francisco and fix her life, and Jake Spoon's going to take her there. And Gus says, "Lori, darling, life in San Francisco, you see, is still just life. If you want any one thing too badly, it's likely to turn out disappointing. The only healthy way to live life is to learn to like all the little everyday things, like a sip of good whiskey in the evening, a soft bed, a glass of buttermilk, or a feisty gentleman like myself." But that's sort of the theme I get from the entire book, is wanting something is just going to be disappointing, and you need to learn to live like the simple life and enjoy the little everyday things. With Lorena, right, she wanted to go to San Francisco to like start a new life and be happy, but then she found that she can enjoy the little simple things like living on Clara's ranch, and she ends up doing that, and she ends up being really happy. This is also, the main thing about the entire journey of the book, which is going to Montana. Woodrow Call is hell-bent on getting up to Montana, but he doesn't really have a good reason. He's just sort of going because he feels like he wants to. He wants to be on what is essentially the final frontier of the West. Once he gets up to Montana, he finds that a lot of the people in his life that were important, like Dietz and Gus, are now dead. And he doesn't really say it, but I get the feeling that he kind of regrets going to Montana and that he'd rather have Gus and Dietz back alive. Especially because he gets to Montana, he starts a ranch, and then he's like, I guess I'll just go to the next job, and then he starts taking Gus back down to Texas. And then I sort of mentioned this throughout the video, but Augustus really likes Clara. They dated in the past, but she ended up marrying a horse trader that he thought was pretty boring. Gus is thinking about like, oh, I'm so excited to see Clara. Maybe she'll marry me. But it turns out, Clara still got her husband. The guy's like brain dead though, so he just kind of stays in a bed. And Clara's like, I'm not marrying again. Gus isn't like disappointed that he saw Clara, but if you think about it too much, you get disappointed with the outcome. So I don't know. I think that's one of the themes in this book. If you look too much about like, oh, I'm gonna move here and restart my life, you're gonna be disappointed. You can restart your life right now. You don't have to move. You just gotta go through life and enjoy the simple things. This next thing I want to talk about is something I think the author was trying to go for that a lot of people don't really realize when they read the book. And I think McMurtry wants to talk about the West and like how awful the people were, really. Because like a lot of these guys are pretty cool and whatnot, but like romantically, all these guys pretty trash. And I think there's a general idea here that the men in this time, they've been hardened by the West and they're very emotionally repressed. And I think the case that's being made here is that men who are emotionally repressed, their actions tend more towards dramatic acts of self-destruction or self-sabotage. And there's a lot of like romance plots, subplots in this book. We have Jake Spoon and Lorena. Jake Spoon wants to go to San Antonio to gamble. Lorena's like, no, you promised to go to San Francisco with me. So he goes into San Antonio, gets really drunk, and then ends up with the Suggs brothers and kind of just ruins his life, killing people, and then he ends up being hung. We have Gus and Clara. Right after meeting Clara, Gus continues up to Montana, and I don't remember the exact quote, but Gus says something along the lines of, yeah, I never would have stayed with Clara. I wouldn't have missed out on the beauty of Montana. And then, like, immediately after, he dies. He had the choice to live, just without his legs. He could have chopped off the other leg, and the gangrene or whatever probably wouldn't have killed him. But he's like, no, I'd rather die. So that's, again, another self-destructive act. We have July Johnson chasing after his wife. He gets his deputy killed. He gets his stepson killed. He gets some random girl killed. And he's so driven on this idea of his wife loving him, but she actually doesn't, that he sort of just like goes to Clara's ranch to work on it. And I don't know, that's sort of self-destructive in nature to me, because he could have just gone to Arkansas and was like, well, my wife doesn't love me, she ran away, I should just do something else. But I don't know. The actions he takes sort of just ruin his life, make it worse. Call and the whore, Maggie, who is Newt, the like 14-year-old boy, his mom. Before the events of the book, Call gets emotional and falls in love with Maggie, but then he leaves and doesn't talk to her, and Newt is born and he refuses to talk to her, and then she dies. It's like, it wouldn't have been that hard to go and talk to her. It's a bit self-destructive. You completely self-sabotaged a relationship there. And probably the most blatant of all of these is Xavier Wands, who runs the old saloon back in the original town of Lonesome Dove. He proclaims his love to Lorena. She says no, and then he's like, my life is ruined, and he burns down his life's work of a saloon and burns himself in the process. That's a pretty dramatic act of self-destruction. But I think this point is sort of why all the characters feel more real, is that they take actions that don't really make sense, but if you apply them to the character, they do make sense. Call is very stoic. He wouldn't want to admit loving someone like Maggie, so he ends up just kind of like wallowing a bit. That's sort of my take on it. I'd also like to point out that while Gus and Call are sort of the main characters of the book, maybe Newt as well, there's a concept in storytelling called the hero's journey, and Lorena is the only character in this book to really go through it. You could argue Call sort of goes through it, but Lorena, it's very distinct. She's the only one in this book with a happy ending. And despite this, she's still only looked as a whore. Even the last line of the book is, they say he missed that whore, which is a mention of Lorena. But despite all of the character development she went through throughout the entire book, she's still only looked at as a whore. So I don't know. Lorena's a really good character in this book. I didn't really get to talk about her or Clara as much as I probably would want to. But on that same topic of the last line of the book, with Xavier Wands burning down his entire life's work, I saw somewhere that that's a bit symbolic of the entire story in general. Woodrow Call, former Texas Ranger, builds this nice horse-selling cattle company down in Lonesome Dove, an outfit, not a company. But he does that, and then he's like, I'm set on going to Montana. And in the process, he burns down all of his life's work, all of his friends. He doesn't even reconcile with his son. And I think it was also pointed out that a lot of Woodrow Call's inability to be emotional to his son stems from his regret of being with Maggie. So because he burned down his relationship with Maggie, he kind of kills any relationship, or at least any paternal relationship he could have with Newt. But he tries his best, he gives him his horse and his gun and his dad's watch. So it might not be the best way to say that you're a kid's father, but I imagine they kind of get the general idea, especially if they know. I'd also like to talk about how this book brings up the idea of what is good. It's sort of mentioned that Gus is like the Epicurean, enjoy the small things in life, while Call is stoic and you need to, follow duty and the law. But there's a lot of contradictions throughout the book that challenge these ideas. One of the more blatant ones is the idea of the wishes of the dead versus the desires of the living. Taking Gus's body down to Texas, especially in a time like the 1870s, not an easy task. Is it really worth your time over caring for your son? That's a big, what is good? Call obviously goes for the more, I think, stoic option, which is following the promises you make. There's also the weird scenario of whether or not they should have killed Jake Spoon. Because Jake Spoon, friend for several years, ran into a long string of bad luck. He's down at his worst. Was hanging him the right call? Was that the good choice to make? Because they know Jake Spoon pretty well. It's a bit out of character for him to go on these things and they know that, and yet they kill him. Because that's what is, I guess, the honorable thing or the duty they have to fulfill. But then up in Montana, when Call is like, okay, maybe I was wrong there, and he lets the kid of the horse thief guy live. When Call gives that Montana boy another chance, the kid goes and ruins it. So it's like, would Jake Spoon have ruined a second chance? He wasn't necessarily nice to Lorena. He goes and gambles. He hangs out with the wrong crowds. As much as we love Jake Spoon, was it a bad choice to kill him? Or should he have lived? What is good? And there's no good answer either. There's also another contradiction in that they hang Jake Spoon for being a horse thief, but all of the cattle that they're running up to Montana is cattle that they stole from Mexico. And because they go into Mexico and steal cows, they're not thieves in America. But if they were to be caught in Mexico, they'd be hanged for the same exact crime as Jake Spoon. So, there's a contradiction there. Like, are they even the correct people to hang Jake Spoon? Do they have that judgment? And then it's sort of talked about a bit by Gus at some points, how he regrets going into Texas and conquering the land, because it is land of the indigenous people, the Native Americans, the Indians, whatever you want to call them. And Gus points out that he really hates that they conquered this land only for bankers to roll in, and now they kind of rule the land. And Gus is like, we settled this land for the wrong people. This book probably doesn't do the best job of depicting Native Americans or Indians, but I think it does a really good job of giving a realistic viewpoint into how people of the time thought. You're probably not going to get a complex indigenous character from this book in the same way you would with modern literature. And there's also mentions of sort of the events going on around the time, like Little Bighorn. The Blood Indians that kill Gus are the same Indians that are being harassed in events like Little Bighorn, or just that entire area during this time. And so you can't really blame these characters killing the main characters, because as a reader, you can kind of put yourself in their shoes. Like, hey, I'm a starving guy, and this person not from my tribe picked up my blind boy. I'm going to run a spear through him. You can sort of understand it, but I understand that the nuance is sort of lost by not having a point of view in one of these characters. But I think the book does a generally good job. And I guess sort of the last thing I want to touch on is there's this sign that they built in Lonesome Dove that they take up north and then they bring back to Texas to put on Gus's grave. Gus really likes Latin, and he puts a Latin phrase on the sign, which is uva uvam vivendo variafit. Essentially means that a grape changes by seeing another grape. I've searched some stuff up. There's some Latin grammar error in the statement, but generally it comes out to the same idea that a grape ripens by seeing another grape ripen. I think that's a good moral of the story, I guess, is that you're going to be affected by the people around you, and because that's always the case, you can't really avoid it. You end up following the rest of the cluster of grapes. They ripen, so you ripen. Someone grabs the grapes and move them, so you move as well. Call goes to Montana, so everyone else goes to Montana. That sort of idea, where as much as you think you have control over your life, you don't control when you're going to ripen. You don't control where you go. It's not really up to you. So just find a cluster of grapes that you trust. And yeah, that's all I have to talk about. And here is the final statue. Let's see. I know you guys have been watching this for 10 minutes now, but I'll kind of explain it. You probably have a good idea. We got a horse, and we got a cowboy that's holding a gun. I've never done an organic before, so I'm pretty happy with the way this one turned out. In my head, this is going to be like Augustus McRae pretty much, but we're going to call him Colonel Colton Oxbow, which is going to be the reason, this town is called Fort Oxbow. But yeah, genuinely, if you guys made it this far into the video, I really appreciate it. I did not mean for this one to go over an hour, and it looks like we're getting to around an hour. Ideally, this would have been a 30-minute video. Next week, we're going to have the finale for Autocraft, so stay tuned for that, and then we should be back on book club. This video took 2 weeks to make. I'm definitely not making a video this long. Unless this one performs really well, then, I'd be happy to do that. I like talking about books. So yeah, let me know if you guys like the longer videos like this and Animal Farm, or if you guys prefer sort of the shorter ones I've been doing. Also, I don't really know what type of books to do for these videos. I kind of just do whatever, and I think I'm going to keep doing just whatever. But based on views, I think people really like the self-help books the most. Which sucks for me, because I think self-help books are mostly a scam. You can read about how to make your life better, but if you don't actually do anything, it's not going to get better. And most people read self-help books and then they never implement the tips. And a lot of self-help books kind of just say the same thing. But I'll probably tackle like one more self-help book while we do this project. But yeah, now that this video has been completed, I think we're going to be going back to a sort of bi-weekly schedule on the books. Sorry for such a long break between this one and the last one, but I should be in a good spot now to just be able to create videos. Next book club episode is going to be Of Mice and Men. That's a nice short one. Gonna see what I can talk about in that. I haven't read it since high school. So if you're interested on getting like the full experience, be sure to read Of Mice and Men sometime in the next 2 weeks or just before you watch that video. Otherwise, you'll just have to deal with my summary. Yeah, let me know what you think of like the video formats. I'm always looking to improve. And let me know if there's any book you want me to read, or like if you want, hey, I want more self-help books, or, maybe some more nonfiction would be better than all the fiction you've been reading. You've been reading a ton of fiction. And I'd be like, yes, I have been reading a ton of fiction, and then I'll read a nonfiction. I've got a list of books that I'm going to read. Most of them are fiction, but I've got a couple nonfiction books scattered around in there, so, we will be getting to it. But if you guys like really want nonfiction, I can move those more up the line. This horse statue was one of those buildings I was kind of afraid of building just because I've never built an organic. I think now that we've got that out of the way, the only big projects are going to be the steel mill, which is mostly a material gathering problem, because that's going to be, because I think I have it built in creative, and it's going to be, I think, two double chests of brick blocks, and I don't have the bricks for that right now. So that'll be something in the future. That's going to be a massive project. And then I'm also going to make like a rail line going through here. That one's going to be a lot of blocks as well. But yeah, other than that, just some small little buildings scattered about. Also, back on the topic of Lonesome Dove, if you are interested in Lonesome Dove, but are like, hey, I'm not reading an 850-page book, you're in luck. Because I was searching around on YouTube, just trying to find like clips of the TV show. And apparently there's some YouTube channel called like Western Clips or something like that. And they've uploaded all 6 hours of the entire miniseries. I'm going to link that in the description if you guys want to check that out. Clearly, if you've made it this far, you're fine with sitting through longer videos. So, you get a free television series on something that might interest you and gives you more context for this video. So that'll be linked in the description. I can't promise that it's going to work in the future, but it works right now as of the uploading of this video. So thank you all for watching. Thank you for listening to me ramble about my favorite book in the world. Love Lonesome Dove. Let me know your thoughts. And I will see you guys next time. So be sure to have a wonderful day.